Hilchos bias Hamikdash perek Rabbi, the laws of coming into the Holy Temple, chapter 4. Yesterday, at length, we discussed the prohibition for people of different degrees of ritual impurity to enter different areas of the temple premises. The whole topic, though, of yesterday's chapter was simply about the entry. Today, the Rambam talks about the next level. Having a Kohen who is ritually impure do not only come into the temple, but do service in the temple. What if a Kohen who was impure did the avodah, did some form of service? That's going to be the topic of today's chapter, and in which cases that's not allowed, in which cases we're actually going to find dispensations where we're allowed to do certain services even though the Kohanim are impure, primarily the Korban Pesach, the Passover sacrifice, but we're going to discuss it all at length today. Says the Rambam halacha aleph tamei she'avad b'mikdash. If an impure person, impure Kohen, did service in the holy temple, chilel avaydasai, he has profaned, desecrated, he has disqualified his service, v'chayav misa b'dei shamayim al avaydasai, and also he's liable to death at the hands of heaven for the service which he performed. Afal pisha lo shahasham, even though he didn't pause there. Yesterday, the Rambam talked about when a person is impure, if he becomes impure, let's say, in the holy temple, if he pauses even for a small amount, the time it takes to bow, then that already constitutes a prohibition. Here the Rambam is saying, even though that element wasn't there, he didn't pause, and the Rambam will soon describe how it's possible to do a service without pausing. Let's just say it was possible to assume that he didn't pause. Nevertheless, because he was impure and did the service in a state of impurity, disqualified, and he's liable to death. Shenemar, as it says, V'yi nazru mikodshe b'nei Yisrael. It's a special verse that was said directly to the Kohanim. Let them separate themselves from the holinesses, from the sacrifices of Israel, v'lo yechalalu es shem kodshi, so that they not profane my holy name. Torah is talking about obviously a certain scenario, because of course the Kohen's job is to deal with the sacrifices of Israel. So what are you saying? Separate yourself from the holy sacrifices of Israel. Obviously it's talking about a specific case. And that case is, this is a warning against serving in a state of ritual impurity. Now here in this verse, it doesn't say what the punishment is. But later on in the very passage it says, they will die by it because they profaned it. Now that's talking about eating truma. It's not talking about service in impurity. It's talking about a whole different thing, but it's in the same passage. So the Rambam says, Ma chilul ha'amur sham. The same way desecrating holy foods, in that case, brings about chayav misa b'dei shamayim, brings about a liability to death at the hands of heaven. Afkan over here too, misa b'dei shamayim, the punishment that it carries, the chilul, v'lo yechalalu es shem kodshi, the desecration carries with it the punishment of death at the hands of heaven. B'chol lav shechayavin alav misa b'dei shamayim, like in the law, we know a general rule, anytime there's a prohibition for which you're liable death at the hands of heaven, you also get lashes by the hands of the physical court. Halacha beis afal pishim avad betuma. Ein chayav bebezdin ela malkos. Pretty extreme, says the Rambam. Even though for serving in a state of impurity, the only thing that the court will hold you culpable for is lashes. Echav hakoyanim lehayu meviyin esel bezdin. If a Kohen was caught serving in the temple in a state of impurity, his fellow Kohanim wouldn't even bring him to the court. Ela moitziyin esel achutz upoitzin etzmeichai. Harsh words. They would take him out and chop open his brain. And no protest was made against them for this. There's a lot of discussion in the commentaries as to how this was allowed, taking the law into their own hands, but the bottom line of it is, this is how extreme serving in the temple in a state of impurity was. The fellow Kohanim would gang up and literally take care of him on the spot. Halacha Gimel, returning to the previous halacha, where the Rambam said that it's possible to serve without a pause. How is it possible for a person to serve in the holy temple without pausing to the point that he will not be liable for excision? That's the usual punishment for staying in the temple in a state of impurity. But if you didn't pause, you wouldn't be liable to the excision. You only be liable to death at the hands of heaven. How is that possible? Let's say a Kohen came in for a regular day of service. It was a routine day. He was pure. Everything was fine. And then he became impure in the temple courtyard. And he went out through the shorter path. And while he was going out, he had a fork, a type of fork in his hand. And on his way out, he stuck it onto the holy altar and turned over a limb that was on the fire on the altar, thereby bringing about, hastening its burning. A hastening of a service is called a service. I didn't have a picture of a Kohen doing that exactly, but you can see here, the Kohenim had these massive forks from which they were able to access the limbs in the fire. Let's say the Kohen was walking on the floor. Obviously, he couldn't be taking a walk up the ramp because that would be a violation of taking the shortest route. Unless, maybe I'm thinking now, maybe he was on top of the Mizbeach. Let's say that's the scenario, okay? Let's say he was on top of the Mizbeach, he becomes impure, so he's running down for the shortest route, and on the way down, he takes his fork and he flips a limb. That could be an interesting case that we can come up with. Okay, but if it was on the floor, the idea would be that it was a much, much, much longer fork, long enough to be able to reach over and flip something on the altar. But again, the point being that there's no pause because he's walking out. He's on his way out. He's fulfilling all the requirements from yesterday. When you become impure, take the shortest route out. But on the way, he's kind of doing something. So the avodah, the service, was done with no pause. And that would hold you liable for the death at the hands of heaven. It's not only somebody who's actually impure that disqualifies the service. Even if somebody was impure, went to the mikveh, but he's what's called a tvul yaim. He's waiting for the sun to set. And he did service before the sun set. Whatever he did is disqualified, and he's liable to death at the hands of heaven. As it says, an additional verse talking about the Kohanim. It says they should be holy to Hashem and not desecrate the name of their God. From tradition we learn, this extra verse is a prohibition directed at a tvul yom, at somebody who went to the mikveh and the sun hadn't set, who communicating to us that he's still considered impure, at least with regards to these laws, that he can no longer serve in the temple. Shenemar, as it says, uva hashemesh v'toher, describing somebody who went to the mikveh. It says he goes to the mikveh and the sun sets and then he becomes pure. Miklal sha'adayin loy tahar, which means again, as long as the sun hasn't set, you haven't become fully pure. Aval mechusar kippurim sha'avad, but for contrast, somebody who went to the mikveh and the sun set, and all that remains is for him to bring a sacrifice. As we spoke about yesterday, there are certain degrees of impurity which require not just a mikveh, but also a sacrifice. You go to the mikveh, you wait till sun sets, and the next day you bring the sacrifice. From the time the sun sets till you bring the sacrifice the next day, you're called mechusar kippurim, lacking atonement. So a person who's lacking atonement, and he serves in the temple, afal pi shavedase psula v'chilel, even though whatever he did is disqualified as well, and he desecrated the service, harei patur, he's exempt. Uminayin shavedase psula, says the Rambam, what's the source that the service is disqualified? Shenemar, because it says, this is a verse we had yesterday as well, when it came to the woman who gives birth, it says, v'chiper aleha hakohen v'tohera. The Kohen helps her bring the sacrifices, and only then does she become pure. Miklal sha'adayin le'nigmera ta'arasa, which implies that until then, the purity is not complete. V'hu adin l'chol mechusrei kippurim, which applies from the birthing woman, we can extrapolate to all other people who are in her category, that have to bring a sacrifice to fully become pure from their impurity, that until the sacrifice is brought, they aren't fully pure. Nevertheless, they don't get the misa b'dei shamayim. And the Rebbe points to a very interesting difference, very interesting nuance, difference in language that the Rambam employs. In the last halacha, when it comes to the tvul yaim, he learns from the verse, it says that he only becomes pure after sunset. That tells us that before then, he's still tameh. The Rambam uses the word tameh. Here in this halacha, when it comes to the mechusar kippurim, he doesn't say it implies that until you bring the sacrifice, you're impure. No, it implies that until you bring the sacrifice, you aren't fully pure. That's very different. Impure and not fully pure is two different things. Impure means actually impure. Not fully pure means you're already pure from any of the laws, you're just not fully pure with regards to the service. And therefore, the punishment is less severe. And there's a longer discussion about this that we're going to be discussing in full, God willing, when we get to the halachas of the mechusar kippurim. There's a whole set of laws called Hilchos mechusrei kapara, the laws of those who need to bring a sacrifice to fulfill their purity. It's in the next book of the Rambam towards the end. So God willing, we get there and we'll discuss this concept at length. Bottom line is, whether you're impure, or you're a tvul yaim, or you're a mechusar kippurim, you definitely don't want to be serving. And if you did, it's disqualified. The punishment varies from level to level. Halacha vav, kohen sha'avad, v'achar kach noida shayatame. Let's say a Kohen did the service, and only afterwards he found out that he was actually impure while he did the service. Imhi tuma yedua. So now we have to examine what kind of impurity was it. If it was an impurity that could have been known before, he just wasn't aware of it, but it was definitely possible to be aware of it. Kala karbanis shehikriv psulim. Every sacrifice that he had brought under the false assumption is disqualified. You got to bring them again. You got to literally track it down and figure out what was brought and re-bring it. because what he did is literally profaned. It's not holy. But if it's a impurity that could not have been known, it's called the tumah of the depths. We had this concept when it came to the laws of the Nazarite. Somebody was buried under the ground, you had no way of knowing. Nobody knew about it. And you walked over it and became impure. Later on, you discovered there's a corpse there. Nobody could have known about it before. Hatzitz meratza. We have a special halacha that says the tzitz, the golden band that the Kohen Gadol wore, achieves atonement. And any sacrifices that he brought under this false assumption of being pure, when he was really impure, are atoned for by the fact that the Kohen Gadol wears this gold band. As a matter of fact, Rambam is going to quote it in a minute, that was part of the job of the tzitz. One of the reasons that the Kohen wore the gold band was to achieve atonement in certain cases, where retroactively that fixes the bringing of certain sacrifices. Even if the Kohen found out that he was impure before he sprinkles the blood, every sacrifice has a couple of steps. First you would slaughter the sacrifice, then you would, in a cup, receive some of the blood that's pouring out, then you would bring the blood to the altar, and then you would sprinkle it on the altar. So let's say he did only part of the service, he slaughtered, he received the blood, he's on the way, and then he finds out that he's impure. You would think he should stop in his tracks. But he goes, no. He found out before he sprinkled the blood, and he still sprinkled it. Hirtza, the tzitz, the golden band, atones for this. Because the tzitz is so powerful, it achieves atonement for a tumah of the depths, even if it was acted upon willfully after discovery. So again, the Rambam says we already explained the concept of tumah of the depths in the laws of the Nazarite. Once we're talking about the power of the tzitz to achieve atonement, says the Rambam al tumas dvarim hakrevin. The tzitz can also achieve atonement for impurity related, not to the Kohen, the person sacrificing, but to the objects being sacrificed. And the Rambam will very shortly make a differentiation. Every sacrifice has two parts. The parts that are brought on the altar and the parts that are eaten. So here the Rambam is specifically referring to dvarim hakrevin, the impurity of the parts of the sacrifice that are offered on the altar. Shanemar, as it says, v'haya al meitzach Aaron, the tzitz, this is the verse about the tzitz, says it will be on the forehead of Aaron the high priest, v'nasa Aaron es avena kadashim, and Aaron will carry with it the sin related to the holy sacrifices. And this word, holy sacrifices, is referring to the parts of the sacrifices that are brought on the altar. But the tzitz cannot achieve atonement for impurity on the part of the sacrifice that's eaten. Neither on the impurity that relates to the person offering the sacrifice, if again he became impure with an impurity that he could have been aware of before, as we said before. Unless it was a type of impurity which is overridden by the community. And we'll talk about that in a minute. There are certain communal sacrifices that override impurity. Even if they're impure, you still bring them. The tzitz could achieve atonement for that. So if we were to summarize a little bit, we have different degrees of impurity in relationship to the tzitz's power to achieve atonement. Relating to the object of the sacrifice, it depends if it's the part that's being offered on the altar, the tzitz works. The part that's being eaten doesn't work. As relates to the person, if it's a tumah of the depths, the tzitz works. If it's a tumah that you could have been aware of, then it depends. What kind of tumah is it? Is it a tumah that overrides? Is it a communal sacrifice that overrides impurity? Then the tzitz works. If not, the tzitz does not work. Halacha ches, regardless of the situation, the tzitz only achieves its atonement when it's on the forehead, being worn by Aaron the high priest. Shenemar, as it says, v'haya al mitzchay tamid. It needs to be on his forehead constantly, l'ratzon lam l'fnei Hashem, to achieve atonement and goodwill for them in front of God. Halacha tes, kol karban she'ein kavua leizman, any sacrifice which doesn't have a set time to be brought, einoi doiche loyas haShabbos v'loyas hatuma, does not override Shabbos, and it doesn't override impurity. Which means that if you need to bring the sacrifice, let's say, for example, there's a sacrifice that has to be brought when you go through a dangerous situation, you need to bring a Thanksgiving offering. But there's no set time when you have to bring that offering. So if the first time you're in Jerusalem is Shabbos, you can't say, hey, I'll bring my Thanksgiving offering today on Shabbos. No. The sacrifice inherently doesn't have a set time. So it doesn't override Shabbos. It also doesn't override impurity. If you're impure, wait till you become pure and bring the sacrifice. The reason for this delay is because there's no problem with the delay. If you don't bring it today, bring it tomorrow, bring it the next day. However, but if it's a sacrifice that has a set time, bein karban tzibur, bein karban yachid, whether it's a communal or a private sacrifice, it pushes away Shabbos, it pushes away impurity because it has to be brought today. Don't be so quick. Doesn't override all impurities. Only impurity related to a corpse. If the people have contacted a corpse before and they couldn't bring the sacrifice now, that's the type of impurity which is overridden by the sacrifice because it has a set time. Halacha Yud says that Rambam kol karbanes hatzibur kavu azmanam. All communal sacrifices have a set time. Lefichach, therefore, kulan deichenas haShabbos ve'as tumas hameis. They all override Shabbos and they all override the tumah related to a corpse. Now, the problem with this halacha is that it seems pretty redundant because the Rambam just said that any sacrifice that has a set time, whether it's communal or private, pushes away Shabbos. So why repeat it the other way? Saying the same thing the other way. All communal sacrifices, you should know, they have a set time. Therefore, they all push off Shabbos and Tumas Meis. So there's a bit of a complexity in explaining this halacha. I saw recently an answer that the Rabbi wrote after giving a talk, and the transcribers had a question on what the Rabbi had said, and the Rabbi, in his edits, kind of inferred an explanation in this halacha, that the Rabbi said the Rambam is not saying, as a fact, that all communal sacrifices have a set time. The Rambam is repeating the condition in the opposite way. Every communal sacrifice needs to have a set time in order to have the power of overriding Shabbos and Tumas Meis. In other words, don't think, it's kind of like the opposite. Don't think that just because it's a communal sacrifice, that's going to mean that it overrides everything. It has to also have a set time. There are actually, by the way, some communal sacrifices that don't have a set time. One of them is called the Par Helim Davar. If the High Court issues a ruling mistakenly, and most Jews stumble because of that ruling and commit a sin, the entire community has to bring a communal sacrifice to atone for that. And there's no set time for it. So obviously the Rambam is not saying Kol Karbanes Hatzibur Kavu Azmanam as a fact, as the Kesef Mishnah actually points out. Rather, the Rambam is saying it's a bit hard to read it into the words, but that's how the Rabbi wants to interpret it, at least in one place. There's other places where the Rabbi seems to be leaning in a different way, but at least in this one place that I saw, the Rambam is saying all communal sacrifices also have to meet the criteria of Kavu Azmanam, and then they can override Shabbos and Tumas Meis. Doesn't fully answer the question of why the seeming redundancy. We can get into it. There's a lengthy discussion on this, but I'm going to leave it for now. And as the verse says, Tein lechacham b'yach kamoid, you give a little bit to a wise man, and the wise man on his own increases his wisdom. Halacha Yud Aleph, v'chol karban mehen shekarev betuma. Anytime you have a sacrifice that's offered in a state of impurity, even if it's allowed to be brought in that state, einei nechal, you still shouldn't eat it. You offer the parts that have to be offered, and whatever usually needs to be eaten, should be burnt. Like any other sacrifice that becomes impure, in which we don't eat it and we just burn it. Halacha Yud Beis. What does it mean that a sacrifice will sometimes override or supersede the laws of impurity? Whether it's a korban that has a set time or it's a communal sacrifice. What it means is like this. If the time to bring the sacrifice arrives, and most of the people that are offering the sacrifice are impure on account of contact with a corpse, where the people are pure, but the priests that are supposed to be the ones offering are impure on account of touching a corpse. Or everybody was pure, people, priests, but the utensils, here, the people, the priests, and the utensils are impure. The sacrifice should be performed and offered in a state of impurity. Everybody can go in as one. Impure, pure, deal with it, doesn't make a difference. They can all go in to the temple courtyard. But if they're impure on account of a different impurity, on account of a bodily discharge, let's say, men or women, or menstruating women, or birthing women, or having become impure on account of touching a rodent, or a carcass of a dead animal, they should not deal with the sacrifice, they should not go into the temple courtyard, even if it happens to be that the sacrifice is being offered in a state of impurity because everybody else is impure on account of a corpse. Doesn't give you, having the bodily impurity, doesn't give you the right to come inside to the temple courtyard. If they transgressed and they dealt with the sacrifice, or they came into the temple courtyard, they're liable to excision for coming in and death at the hands of heaven for serving. Because the only thing which is overridden is impurity on account of a corpse. If there's a Passover sacrifice, which was being brought in a state of impurity, and people who were impure on account of a corpse, who were allowed to be there, but because there was so much pressure, they ended up inside the heichal. There's a picture of the gates opening up and they're trying to kind of like squeeze in. And they're exempt. Even though they're impure and they were only allowed in this one case to come into the temple courtyard, since I'm no longer applying the verse that says, send them out of the camps, they are exempt. Yeah, they shouldn't be in the temple structure, they should be only in the courtyard, but if they pushed in, it's okay. The Rabbi learns there's a powerful lesson. Why were they pushing? Because there were so many Jews in the courtyard, right? Passover sacrifice, everybody's bringing it. It was very, very squishy. When Jews are together, when Jews are united, we can achieve the highest heights. Here you have somebody who only should be in temple courtyard, but because it's squishy, he ends up in the higher level of holiness. He ends up in the heichal. He could even end up in the Kodesh HaKodashim. If it's so squishy, they may squish him all the way in. Because when Jews are together, we can reach the highest of heights. What if there's part of the daily clan is impure, part of them is pure, even though in total most of them are impure from a dead body, there are pure kohanim, they should be the ones to be offering the sacrifice. Even if the entire daily clan was impure from a dead body, bring another daily clan. They don't have to serve today. Bring somebody else from that week. What if the entire weekly rotation of Kohanim became impure? Try to find a different rotation. Only if most of the priests who are accessible and available in Jerusalem at that time are impure, then yasu betuma, then they should do it in impurities. In other words, even though we're saying, and it kind of sounds like, tuma overrides the sacrifice overrides the tuma, you got to take into account all the details. It's got to be completely inaccessible in any other way. As long as there's a way for pure people to do it, they should do it. Why are we looking for a way out? Why are we looking for pure people from a different daily clan? Because the idea is not that the impurity was lifted when it comes to a community. The prohibition to serve in impurity is standing there full force. It's only pushed away. It's pushed aside because of the pressure. But we can only push away things if there's no other way. By the way, that's why you have to have the tzitz to atone for it. If it was lifted, if it was completely okay, then just do it. Don't look for anybody. And why do you need the tzitz to atone? Because this is a very big thing in halacha, hutra or tchuya. Sometimes prohibitions are lifted. Other times they're only pushed away. When they're only pushed away, you must have exhausted every excuse to push it away. When things are lifted, they're totally lifted. Sometimes, let's say a case of pikuach nefesh, someone needs to eat treif. According to many opinions, it's completely lifted. It's not like you have to go and try to find kosher food, and then if you have kosher food, then you give non-kosher food. You go right for the non-kosher food. It's totally permitted. Here it's dechuya. It's pushed away, because it's only being pushed away only when you need to. What's the biblical source for the fact that corpse tuma is overridden in the face of a community? Shenemar, it says, this is the story of the second Passover sacrifice. There were people that were impure on account of a corpse. The whole idea of the second Passover happened because most people were pure. Some people were impure. They asked Hashem for a second chance. They got a second chance. What do we learn from this? Kach lomdu mipi hashmua. From tradition, we learn the following: Sha'anashim yichidim heim sheyidachu lepesach sheni. Only individual people can be pushed away to the second Passover im hayu tmeim if they were impure. Avol tzibur shayu tmeim, but if the entire community was impure from a dead body, ein anidachin, they're not pushed away. Ela hatuma tidacha, the impurity is pushed away. V'yasu pesach v'tuma, let them offer the pesach in a state of impurity. From the Passover sacrifice, we derive to every other sacrifice that has a set time, that it pushes away impurity. And the Rambam now goes even further and demonstrates this matter is actually very clear in the verses. And this is a story told in Divrei Hayamim, in Chronicles, where King Chizkiyahu, who was a very huge tzaddik, took over the kingship from Achaz, who was a tremendous sinner and had gotten the Jews to basically completely reject all the ways of the Torah. And he tried to re-inspire the people, and he saw Pesach was coming. He wanted the people to bring a Passover sacrifice, but he knew that everybody is impure. So what he did was, at the very end of Adar, he decided to make a leap year. He added a second Adar, pushing off Pesach by a month. And he was hoping that that was going to get people to become pure from whatever impurities they had, and they'll be able to bring the Korban Pesach on time. So he did that. He moved the calendar, and then he sent messengers all around Israel with a message. Guys, it's a new time, it's a new era. Do tshuva. Don't keep holding to the ways of your ancestors. Come back. And many people didn't take to it. They laughed at his messengers. They were very, very slow to come forth. The Kohanim, the Leviim, not even them. They didn't even purify themselves fully. And what ended up happening was that some people did come, but many, many people stayed impure. Even after getting the month's delay, they were still impure. And nevertheless, they brought the Passover sacrifice in impurity. Says the Rambam is going to demonstrate it into the verses. Shenemar Sham, it says in Divrei Hayamim, Ki rabas bakohol asher lo hiskadashu. There was a majority of the community that had not sanctified themselves, and nevertheless, v'halavim al shchitas hapsachim. The Levites, including the Kohanim, oversaw the slaughtering of the Passover sacrifice, l'chol loy tahar lahakdish laHashem. For all those who were impure, they still oversaw it to make it holy to God. Kimar bisa'am, rabas, from many of the people, a lot of them, Ephraim, Menashe, Yisachar, Zvulun, loy hitaharu. They hadn't become pure. And nevertheless, they did the Korban Pesach. So you see here that the Passover sacrifice is brought even in a state of impurity. Now the Rambam says, if you keep reading the verse, you might have a question. Umahu zeh shenemar, why does it then say in the verse, Ki ochlu as haPesach b'lei chakosuf, that they ate the Passover sacrifice not the way it's written in the Torah? If they were allowed to bring the sacrifice in impurity, so what was the big deal? Says the Rambam, mipnei she'ibru oisa hashana mipnei atuma. The problem wasn't in the bringing of the Passover sacrifice. The problem was in the circumstances leading up to it. I told you before, he added another month. They made the year into a leap year because of the impurity, Shanemar, as it says in the beginning of the chapter there, Vayivoat HaMelech v'sarav v'chol hakol b'Yerushalayim. The king and his ministers and all the people in Jerusalem took counsel and they decided La'asos HaPesach b'Chodesh HaSheni, to move forward the Passover to the second month. In other words, they made the first month, Nisan, 1 month later, because they couldn't do it at the time because most of the Kohanim hadn't become sufficiently pure. In the laws of establishing the new months in the Jewish calendar, we explained impurity is not a reason to initially go ahead and make a leap year. And that was the problem. By the way, says the Rambam, there was another problem that year. When did he decide to make the leap year? On the very last day of Adar, the 30th day of Adar, which potentially it should have been, and it was fit to be, the new month of Nisan. And at that point, he made a second Adar. The rest of the sages didn't agree to Chizkiyahu's decision. We don't declare a leap year on the last day of the month. You have up to that day of the month. As long as it's still fully Adar, you can do the leap year. Once it's already 30th day, which could be Nisan, you don't do a leap year. Because of these things that Chizkiyahu committed, not according to Jewish law, Nemar, therefore it says, Ki ochlu as haPesach b'lei chakosov, they ate the Passover sacrifice, not in the way that it was written. But in the actual sacrificing, the actual offering, bringing it in purity, that was totally allowed. For the other problems that he made, Yechizkiah indeed begged for mercy on account of himself and on account of the sages who agreed to his actions. As it says, Ki hispalel Yechizkiyahu aleim leimor. Yechizkiyahu davened for them, saying, Hashem atoy v'chaper ba'ad, let the good God atone for whoever wanted to do the right thing and didn't end up doing the right thing. And it also says, Vayishma Hashem al Yechizkiyahu, Vayirpo es ha'am, Hashem listened to Chizkiah, he healed the nation, meaning, Shenirtza korbanam, their sacrifice was accepted, and hence, in the end of the day, not only was the sacrificing and the offering done properly, but even retroactively, nothing was considered to be not as it was written. Everything was completely done in alignment with Hashem's will. The larger point being, from here we see that even a state of impurity, when facing the community overrides the impurity.